In History of the Atom Parts 1 and 2, we learned about how scientists discovered atoms and their internal structure. But in this class, we're learning about organisms, and organisms contain many different types of atoms, and it's the interactions between those atoms that allow organisms to do their thing. So in this video, we will explore matter, stuff that has mass and takes up space. It's logical when studying matter to ask, what's the matter? And in order to answer that question, you need to know what atoms are inside. So these two words are very connected to each other. So let's say that we go up to a chunk of matter that contains atoms of one type. If that's the case, we call that pile of matter an element. If there are different types of atoms inside, we call it a compound. But within these broad categories, there are smaller subcategories with different properties. So amongst elements, there are atomic elements and molecular elements. Amongst compounds, there are molecules and ionic compounds, or salts. And then there are substances like ions that fall somewhere in between these. You might not have heard of all of these terms. However, you have encountered examples most likely in your life. Oxygen gas, which we breathe in, N2, the most common gas in the atmosphere, neon inside neon lights, sodium chloride or table salt, carbon dioxide, which we breathe out, water, which we drink in, and glucose, which we eat. Our task during this video is to sort all these substances into their appropriate categories. And to do that, we need to examine their atomic structure and how those different atoms interact. Alright, structure first. Remember, this is what an atom looks like. Atoms have an inner region called a nucleus, which contains protons, which are positively charged, and neutrons, which do not have any charge. Together, the neutrons and the protons account for most of the atom's mass. Then on the outside of the atom are negatively charged electrons. Each element on the periodic table has atoms with different numbers of particles inside. For example, this hydrogen atom right here has an atomic number of 1 because it has only one proton in its nucleus. Like any atom, it is neutrally charged overall, meaning that it must also have a little electron, a negative charge, balancing out the positive of the proton. However, this carbon atom right here has an atomic number of 6, which means it has 6 protons inside its nucleus and 6 corresponding electrons moving around its outside. And the further down the table you go, the bigger the atoms get. Check out this neon atom, or maybe even this chlorine atom is huge. So just like Dmitri Mendeleev promised, the periodic table does order atoms by size. But Mendeleev also created this table to organize elements by chemical properties. What gives atoms their chemical properties? In other words, what dictates how one atom interacts with another atom? Well, if you picture a hydrogen atom right here, with its single proton and single electron, and it encounters a nitrogen atom, with its protons, neutrons, and electrons, you can see that as they approach, it's the electrons that would first make contact with each other. So it's the number of electrons that determines the chemical properties of an atom, of a particular element. For example, carbon is a very social atom and often hangs out with other atoms because of its electron configuration, while neon over here very rarely hangs out with other atoms and is not very reactive because of its electron configuration. How would the electrons determine how an atom behaves? When atoms hang out, just like when people hang out, scientists call that bonding. So atoms bond. And why do they bond? In order to become more stable. Now you might also bond with your friends so that you feel more stable. But scientists mean something specific when they say the word stable. Picture in your mind a delicious glass of ice water that is leaning precariously on the edge of a coffee table. The glass is very unstable because with a slight perturbation of the table, the glass might go falling off the edge and smash on the floor. It has great potential for change. If you push the glass into the center of the table, it becomes more stable. It is less likely to change. Atoms, on the other hand, become more stable when their outermost electron shells are full. This is true of all of the elements in the last family on the periodic table, which are called noble gases. Noble gases are said to be inert, non-reactive, or stable. All of these words mean approximately the same thing, namely that these atoms do not need to bond to become stable, they're already stable. As scientists continue to model the atom, they represented this by showing their outer electron shells as complete. For example, helium's shell is filled with 2 electrons in it. Neon's outer shell filled with 8, and argon's outer shell also filled with 8. The other elements in the table are not so lucky. For example, this poor lithium atom, yes, its inner shell is filled with the 2 necessary electrons, but its outer shell only has 1. Same with poor sodium. These elements are very reactive. Remember, these are the ones that the chemist student threw into the toilet, and their outer shells definitely aren't full. Nor are the shells of the atoms in between. So even though beryllium has 2 electrons, boron has 3, carbon has 4, it's not until you get to that maximum of 8 that an atom is stable. So what can all of these atoms do in order to become as stable as the Nobel gases? Well, if they hang out with each other and share electrons, they might be able to fill their outer shells. For example, if oxygen could just get 2 more electrons, then it would have a full outer shell just like neon. And if hydrogen could get just 1 extra electron, it could look just like helium. So oxygen and hydrogen sometimes make a deal. Say here's an oxygen atom with its 8 protons in the middle, 2 happy electrons here, and then 6 lonely electrons along the outside. And then here you have 2 hydrogen atoms, proton in the middle, lonely electrons in their outer shells. If these 3 atoms all hang out very close to each other, then they can share electrons, as shown right here. This might have been the hydrogen's electron, and this might have been one of oxygen's electrons. Same right here, this might have been one of hydrogen's electrons, and this one might have been one of oxygen's electrons. In this arrangement, though, the hydrogen atoms now have 2 electrons in their outer shell, and their outer shell is full. Same with this hydrogen atom. And this oxygen atom right here also has a full outer shell with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 electrons in it. In other words, the atoms formed a bond in which they share electrons in order to become stable. And this kind of bond has a special name. It's called a covalent bond. And the result of those bonds? Molecules. You may have already recognized, for example, that this molecule right here is a water molecule. H2O, 2 H's, 1 O. The covalent bonds in molecules can be drawn several ways. In these drawings, like the one on the last slide, you can see these 2 hydrogen atoms, each having brought their own electron to the party, and in sharing have completed their outer shells, 2 in this hydrogen and 2 in this hydrogen. But chemists are lazy and they don't like to draw out this whole picture every single time they want to talk about a covalent bond. So most of the time they use a structural formula in which they just draw the letters of the name like this H and then connected by a single line connected to another H. So a single bond is represented just by a line. They also have shorthand for more complex molecules. For example, these oxygen molecules are sharing 2 sets of electrons. This oxygen is sharing its 2 electrons right here, and this oxygen is sharing its 2 electrons right here. So that forms something called a double bond, which chemists represent with 2 lines instead of 1. Each line represents a pair of shared electrons. You will also occasionally see a space-filling model of molecules in which the atoms are represented like spheres that have been smushed together. So just know that if you see a diagram like this, it also means a covalent bond in which electrons are being shared between the atoms. Unfortunately, most atoms didn't go to kindergarten and didn't learn that sharing is caring. So from time to time there are atoms that steal electrons from other atoms. And it's not just any atoms either. It's these ones, fluorine and chlorine. These atoms are super greedy. Of course they would be, because all they need to fill their outer shells is just 1 more electron right here or 1 more electron right here. So they are greedy as can be to try to get a new electron and become stable like a noble gas. There are also some really generous atoms that live on this side of the periodic table, such as lithium and sodium, that have 1 electron in their outer shell, which they are so eager to give up, because if a lithium were to give up that electron, then it would be left with a full outer shell of 2 electrons. That's the shell that's right underneath. So when fluorine or chlorine gets together with lithium or sodium, something new happens. The chlorine atom steals an electron from the sodium atom. This transforms the atoms so much that scientists have given them new names. Once a sodium atom has lost that electron, it is now called a sodium ion. And once a chlorine atom has gained an electron, it is now called a chloride ion. So ions are atoms that have gained or lost electrons. Now that they've done that, they're much more stable. You can see the sodium now has its full outer shell of 8 electrons, as does the chlorine atom. But because the chlorine atom has gained an electron, it's gained a negatively charged particle, which means that the overall chloride ion now has a net negative charge. Because the ion now has more electrons out here than it has protons inside its nucleus, so overall negative. The opposite has happened to the sodium ion. Because it's lost an electron, but it's kept the same number of protons, the overall charge of the sodium ion has become positive. As you know, opposites attract, and so the sodium and chloride ions attract each other and in what's called an ionic bond. Ions can form multiple ionic bonds at once. For example, if one chloride ion sits next to a sodium ion and then ionic bonds with another chloride ion and another sodium ion and so on, you can make a big crystal like this one, which is actually the close-up of a salt crystal like you'd shake on your food. When chemists use the word salt, they're talking about an ionic compound, a substance made of atoms that have gained or lost electrons, becoming ions, and forming ionic bonds. Ions are attracted to each other not because they're sharing electrons, but because one has stolen electrons from the other, leaving a negative charge of one particle and a positive charge on the other, and opposites attract. To conclude, what's the matter? Well, matter is always made of atoms. If that matter contains just one type of atom, then it's called an element. If the atoms inside that element are covalently bonded together, then it's known as a molecular element. That is, molecules containing just one element like O2 or N2. If the atoms are not bonded together because they're already stable, then they form an atomic element, such as this neon atom, which has no need to bond to anything since it's... What if the matter does contain more than one type of atom? Well, then it's called a compound. And depending on how the atoms are bonded together, they get different names. So, if the atoms are sharing electrons, then they are attached by covalent bonds, and they form a molecule. Examples of molecules include CO2, carbon dioxide, H2O, water, or C6H12O6, glucose. If these atoms are not sharing electrons, then they have instead gained or lost electrons. The atoms have become positively or negatively charged, and thus are called ions. These oppositely charged particles attract to form ionic bonds, and the ionic bonds hold together ionic compounds or salts, such as sodium chloride. So next time you're wondering what the matter is, use this flowchart and it should help.